Welcome everyone and welcome to this webinar about why organizations use synthetic data as test data. We are very much looking forward to today's session to deep dive into synthetic data and to various aspects around that. And as for today, we have two guests here from RisQIT, Francis Welbie, and from BG.legal, Frederick Droppert, who will join us to deep dive into various aspects around synthetic data generation, test data, and relevant topics to consider around this. Francis, can I give the word to you to provide the guest with an introduction?
Yes, of course. My name is Francis Welbie. I've been in testing like already for 30 years, I guess. So it's a real fun job to do. I think one of the best jobs in IT. I hear no cheer. I'm sorry. So I have my own company, which is called RisQIT, with also with employees, and we are working for all kinds of different companies, for governmental companies. We're doing stuff with passports. We are also doing retail, energy, all kinds of stuff. And I love to talk about testing and test data. So I'm really proud to be here, Wim Kees.
Thank you very much, and looking forward to deep dive into really the aspects around software testing. And next, Frederick Droppert from BG.legal. Could you also provide the guest with an intro?
Sure. Thank you. My name is Frederick Droppert. I'm a legal professional at BG.legal. So not a lawyer, to make the distinction. We're a full-service law firm with offices in Den Bosch and Eindhoven. And my specialties personally, because I was formerly also an ITer, are in IP, privacy, data, and emerging technologies. So synthetic data definitely part of that. And everything regarding AI, for example, is very much in my area of expertise.
Thanks, and looking forward to deep dive into that as well. I should also provide you with an introduction. So my name is Wim Kees Janssen, one of the founders of Syntho. I have a background in the financial sector. I was responsible for the development of various tech solutions like the mobile apps, client portals, and in that role faced all kinds of challenges in getting the test data right. Today during this webinar, on the one hand, would like to deep dive into a couple of those challenges and how we aim to solve them with Syntho. Before we start, some practical details. So of course, welcome to all of you. During this webinar, you can ask questions via the email. So if you have questions, please send them to info@syntho.ai. You will also see that on top of the screen in some of the slides. And we will try to answer those questions during the webinar for you. Next to that, we will share the slides after this webinar. So no need to take notes right over the slides. They will be shared with you. The webinar will take approximately 40 minutes, followed by Q&A. And of course, we try to integrate the Q&A as much as possible into the presentation. So really looking forward to that. And as mentioned, if you have questions, please send them to info@syntho.ai. Then as a starter, I think what is interesting is that I shared some polls via LinkedIn with some interesting questions. And today I would like to share some of the poll results with you. Not only share them with you, but also discuss the results with the speakers. So as an example, question 1 was, would you be interested in joining a webinar about test data? Now, I think you're all on the right spot, but it's interesting to see that 82% voted at yes, with a result of 417 votes. Just to give you an idea about what I mean with the polls on LinkedIn. And we have, of course, various questions asked to the people on LinkedIn about test data and aspects around it. maybe before we deep dive into them, I think it's interesting to start with maybe one question, because we are in the middle of the digital revolution, and software development is crucial in actually accelerating that digital revolution. But maybe, Francis, why is actually testing important in the development of those solutions?
Well, that is a question that can be answered in various ways. First thing is, of course, if we talk about testing, we always say, yes, we have to prevent bugs coming into production. So that's always the first answer to give. But I think it's also, if you are more and more into testing, you also see that nowadays we do continuous testing, right? Because we have continuous deployments and continuous development, all things around. So every day we ask ourselves, is this the right feature? Is this the right application that we want to use? Is it fit for purpose, right? Do we really find that market spot, or do we really satisfy those customers, or do we really satisfy those users? And do we really get the return on investment on it, for example, right? And that's, of course, it has something to do with bugs, but it is much wider. It is much wider. It has to do with trust, with learning, with exploring, with training, right? And so we do it every day. And currently, the current way of developing, right, with the CI/CD pipelines, also requires continuous testing. And of course, also the continuous usage of test data, right? I think a very important step in testing is, of course, hey, what is the context that I'm testing in? And context, I mean, maybe the organization, but also environmental stuff, right? What can I not do in this context? And well, we are also living in a data-driven society currently, so I think that's also coming back in our testing. So therefore, testing is, well, it's crucial. It's crucial. It gives us insight into the product. It gives us insight into quality, but also insight into what can we expect.
Yeah, and given that that topic about testing, what is actually the role of test data in that?
Well, I think if you don't have any test data, you cannot test, of course, because all the tests that we do are using data provided by the application, by the test object that we are going to test, right? Or the context that we're going to test in. So it is crucial. It is crucial. Without any test data, and I mean in all aspects, right? We call files, we call databases, all those kinds of things. You cannot do anything. So it is crucial to have great test data to perform testing smoothly.
Yeah. And given test data, what do you see in practice? What do you see companies use as test data?
Well, of course, it depends on what level you're going to test, right? If you're going back to unit testing, you will create your own test data more often, hopefully, because that will make your unit tests very lean and mean. You can be very flexible, right, in running your tests, and you have a very small piece to test, right? So a very small bit to test. So then you can create your own test data more often, and you will be more flexible. The further you will drop towards some sort of a release, right? You will go to functional testing. Maybe you'll also go to acceptance testing, right? You will need that test data to create and to execute trustful test cases. So if your test data is wrong, you can get false negatives or false positives, even worse, right?
Yeah.
So your test data is actually crucial for your starting point.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think having heard that the test data should reflect the original data and business logic that's in the data. I think
yes. I think yes. You can also, of course, use your own data again, your own created data. But there is always the urge to also somehow put your test case into a real life situation, right? And if you want to have a real life situation, you need to have real life test data. And then your troubles begins, right? Because you have a lot of test data in prod. Oh no, I'm sorry. A lot of data in prod.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And of course, we all love to use that data because that's the truth. Yeah. If that data runs in our system, then everything will run smoothly. Well, difficult.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's an interesting question to discuss as well. Because we typically see organizations using original data. And that's of course what is most similar to what we see in test data.
Yeah.
And one of the topics that we asked also via LinkedIn is what test data do you use? And I think that's can be one of the interesting slides to share as well with you.
Yes,
really looking forward to discuss that as well. So the question was, what test data do you use? We gave a couple of options. We see production data, mask data, synthetic data, and other, again, 289 votes, so quite a lot. Just going through this slide, Francis, what's your view on this?
I think it is like, to me, it's an awful lot of work, the first two. It's an awful lot of work. Because if you use prod data, right, production data, what do you do in practice, right? If you use prod data, you will often would like to load your production data into your test environments, right?
Yeah.
Actually, what you do is some sort of a copy from your production to your test. And there, of course, the trouble begins because you have problems with fitting it into your environment because your test environment is way too small, or you have all kinds of dysfunctionals between your prod environment and your test environment, so your production data will not load. That's your first thing, right? So that's an awful lot of work. My experience is just do a copy from prod, and people will say to me, "Well, Francis, it will take me just 2 days." It will always take not 2 days, but at least 2 weeks. And then you have to go into your test environment, check out what's going on in your test environment, if everything is still running. So it will cost a lot of effort. It will cost a lot of time to do this. If you do also mask data, so if you're going to mask your data, you will do something extra and your troubles will be even higher, right? So it's a lot of effort. It seems like an easy step because, hey, the data is there, just copy it into your test environment and that's it. But in practice, it will mean a lot of work from a lot of people.
Right? What I also think is interesting, Francis, but I'm actually interested in your view. I think the answer itself is honest. I mean, using production data is being done by a lot of, well, let's say people. But I think that is mainly because they have the perception that using production data is easier.
Exactly, because it's available. It seems available.
Yeah, you have it right there.
Yeah,
it's in the database. All you have to do is copy paste.
Well, yeah.
That's the belief, I think.
That's the belief. Yes. That's one thing. The other thing, what is, of course, an advance for using production data. If you are going not to test in a test environment, but if you're just going to test in production, well, then it is of course pretty easy. And that's also a topic that is going around in the test field, right? Testing in production. But that's a totally different topic from this. what I was saying, it is indeed what you're saying. It is a lot of effort, while it seems very easy peasy, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's also has to do with, if it's a lot of work, then you will not do that very often. Because every time you do that copy step from prod, and you do your masking, right? Every time you will have those troubles. So what is actually happening with your prod data in a test environment, it will differ in time from your prod data. The most valuable production data is just after the copy in your test environment, if everything is running smoothly. But after a while, for example, I know companies who did it once a year or once half a year, right? Your data becomes old, becomes rubbish, becomes much sure how to say that, but it's become dirty data, right? So that's not trustful anymore, right? It is not reflecting your prod, and that's also interesting because what you said, it seems very easy, but yeah, you do a lot of effort, a lot of frustration there, and after 1 month, you're already off. You're already off prod. So what is your trustworthy and easy peasy stuff there? Yeah. I think you should do differently.
Yeah, yeah, and let's see indeed how we can do it differently. Maybe before we deep dive into that, also curious, Frederick, to hear your opinion about that, because indeed using production data seems obvious because it's of course most similar to the data that represent your business logic. But what's your perspective on that, more from a regulatory point of view?
Yeah, I think everyone by now knows the GDPR. So when there's personal data in production data, which there often is, we might have a problem. And with we, I mean that a certain governing body thinks that processing that personal data might not be acceptable. And that is because we think that people need to know when I'm processing their data. So processing it in the first place, when I put the data in there for a certain purpose with a legal basis, does not mean that I can legally use the same data to do some testing, which is a different processing activity. So it matters a lot on the purpose for which I gathered the data in the first place, and the actual question to which it all begins, if there is any personal data in there. Because if there is, it might not be viable to use that production data after all. And that is something that is also a bit of a problem, because not often do the people that think about the question, am I going to use the production data, also think about the question, is this production data actually data with personal data in it, yes or no?
Yeah.
They just see an opportunity to use something, which I personally totally get. But we also need to think about the legal implications.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that introduces one of the next polls that we asked. Do you use privacy sensitive data as test data? Because using production data, what you mentioned, Frederick, is of course a thing. But if it's privacy sensitive data, then it's a different topic. And I think interesting results here is that actually 28% voted on yes, and 72% voted on no from the 231 votes.
Yeah.
What's your view on those results?
The question is, though, Wim Kees, if I may interrupt, if people know what privacy sensitive data is. So the 72% might be even higher. Or lower, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm of the same mind, totally. I think the answers are honest. I honestly do. I just think that there might be some disparity between answering yes, because they do use it, or the answers with no that actually still use privacy sensitive data, just they simply don't know that it is. And this is difficult to explain, because what is privacy sensitive data? It's using data that is considered personal data. Personal data is data that says something about a natural living person. If I can use data to identify one single person out of a group, no matter how large that group is, it can also be two people, two is a crowd, then all of a sudden it is personal data. And sometimes a database contains, let's say, data, not necessarily personal data, and the database in itself is not considered personal data. But somewhere in the back of a storage room, there's another database to which I have access, and combining those two data sets allows me to identify a person. Then sometimes that data set that was not personal data all of a sudden does become personal data. And this, again, as I said, is a problem because of the GDPR.
Yeah.
Now, there are exceptions to this rule, and it's not as clear-cut as, hey, I also have access through this client that was a client somewhere 10 years ago, yada, yada, yada. No, it is a bit more complicated than that, but the fact that sometimes data is considered non-personal and then all of a sudden it can switch to personal data is definitely a concept that we need to be aware of.
Yeah, and I think the interesting part about this as well is sometimes there's confusion about this, and that's why we also, that's also interesting that the Dutch Authority on Personal Data, recently put a statement about this on the website, literally with the question: am I allowed to use personal data for testing purposes of my system of application? Yeah, and that's what I typically say now as well. It's typically not necessary to test with personal data because there are alternatives possible.
Yeah, I actually like this very much because also on the website of the AP there is an explanation. So as you might know, you have 6 legal bases to do processing of personal data, and one of them is to ask permission. And so everyone, when the GDPR came into effect, thought, well, let's just ask permission for everything, and then everything will be okay. But then the actual AP itself also says that asking permission for everything is not a very practical way to go about it. So actually what you should probably do is just try to avoid processing personal data altogether. And what the Dutch DPA says here is, well, there is a possibility, because if you can somehow change that personal data into non-personal data, but still get results that are effective for your purpose, then we're just doing one processing activity.
Yeah.
But I don't want to venture too far into this question, because the actual question definitely is that using it might be troublesome, and therefore the AP suggests other means, definitely.
Yeah, and that's of course had a big question then, given the fact that you're actually not allowed personal data as test data. What are the alternatives then?
Sure. Well, first of all, we can just try to go about it through another mean, just see if there's another option to get the same result, but often there isn't, or the result will not be as good. And I want to refrain from what good is, but that's up to the people actually working with the data. But sometimes using something like synthetic data or fully anonymized data is an option. And what that basically says is you have the data containing personal data. And by changing it in such a way that I can no longer identify the same person, or rather any person in that data set, I could go about my ways. There is one little paradox here, and you probably already heard it, because if I'm going to change the data or shape the data or do anything with it, this is considered a processing activity. Therefore, I'm processing personal data.
Yeah.
Luckily, the AP already foresaw this, or even better, the GDPR already foresaw this. And when the GDPR came out, there is also this huge beacon of information surrounding the GDPR provided by the people that actually thought of it. And they already mentioned that processing personal data into, well, synthetic or anonymized data, fully anonymized data, is an option. It usually complies with the purpose to which the data was originally gathered. Usually, or often, I should say. Not 100% of the time, but if you gather the data for that purpose, then you can process it into, well, data that is no longer related to the person.
Yeah. Yeah, and I heard indeed, fully anonymized data, synthetic data. I think what we also asked via the poll is, does your data, your test data, reflect production data? And with the votes, I'm happy about it, I'm not happy about it, we use production data. And I think we see quite some interesting results. Maybe Francis, maybe it's interesting to hear your opinion about this, because for your in the testing environment, this is of course a relevant question. Does your test data reflect the production data?
It's always hard. It's always hard because you're always getting well. Your test, if you run a test, you always have to check out the results, right? And those results are always reflected in data. So are you able to check out the outcome of data which is not production? If you run the same test in prod, you will see an end result, and those results you can compare with in a test environment, right? So that's, I think, hard to deal with for some testers. On the other hand, you actually, if you use data which is reflecting production data, you can run the test over and over and over again, right? You are fully in control as a tester of the test data, because as you just learned, if you as a tester, well, I will not do it, but if you put in like a USB stick in your laptop, download all your test data, which is production data, bring it home with you, then you immediately have a leak. If you do it with synthetic data, it's yours. You can do whatever you want. And that's interesting. Yeah. So if you're not happy about it, then you have to check out, okay, what is your purpose? What is the purpose of your test, right? It can also be that you want to do a lot with your test data, which can be done with prod, which cannot be done by synthetic data or created data by yourself, right? Yeah. That's actually a question that, of course, you can answer in several ways. You can or fix it, trying to make it more predictable, for example, or you can say, hey, this is such a low risk in this case, we will just accept it, right? Or it is a huge problem, we have to eventually test it in production maybe, right? That can also be an issue. So if you're not happy about your test data, then I think you're not happy about your testing, actually, and then you have to do something about it. Or you change your strategy, so do something else, or you will fix it. Yeah. And I'm always, if you look, for example, right, because we're talking about synthetic data, and we're talking about the products that you have, Wim Kees. Well, I love the idea of having my own data, and that I don't have to bother about laws and GDPR. And I love to share data within my company, and even maybe with people outside of my company, outside of the organization that I'm working with. Because I also, that's the other thing, right? If you do testing, and you do, for example, end-to-end testing or between organizations, maybe you also have to exchange test data to another company. You cannot do that with production data. That's totally, that's creepy. So there you need actually synthetic data. And if that's reflecting more or less a trustful production situation, right? Not the actual production situation, but the trustful, but if it reflects a trustful production situation, I think then everybody will be happy. But you will not have the 100% trustfulness of your production data, but you're 95%, or maybe you're 99%, right? And I think that's what we have to strive for.
Yeah. And yeah, I heard indeed the topic synthetic data. I think for the audience that are not familiar yet with the concept of synthetic data generation, I think it's interesting to do a brief intro about what it means, and also go back indeed to what does that technique means in terms of more the legal point of view and a testing point of view. And so synthetic data generation, in this case with artificial intelligence. How does it work? Typically, organizations have, of course, an original production data set or database. In this case, we assume it, for example, contains personal data. That can be healthcare data, financial data, at least data that tells something or everything about an individual. In this case, there's a synthetic data generation platform. We offer that in the form of the Syntho engine. With artificial intelligence, it learns statistics, patterns, and relationships that are in the original data. And thereafter is able to generate a completely new data, artificially generated data. That's what we call synthetic data. But with the key difference that it mimics the original data in the synthetic data. So it reproduces the statistics, patterns, and relationships in the synthetic data. And actually to such an extent that you can do analytics on it. So the business rules are preserved, and that's the value, at least, that we see in synthetic data. That on data point level, it's fully artificially generated data, so it's fake data. While on data set or database level, you can use it as if it's a real data because the business logic is preserved. And as it is preserved to such an extent that you can do it for analytics. It typically can be used as test data not only for software development, but also for the development of business intelligence and maybe even artificial intelligence applications that really need advanced reproduction of the characteristics and patterns. So I think that's an interesting topic, of course, and curious, of course, to hear as well the opinions from Frederick and Francis about the legal and implications for testing purposes.
Yeah,
Frederick, do you want to kick it off?
Sure. One of the things with synthetic data is that it still carries, let's say, a risk. It needs to be done well, and this is a problem because the question of if it's done well cannot be answered by, let's say, everyone. The people asking for synthetic data are not necessarily the ones that are capable of answering the question, is this good synthetic data? Is it usable synthetic data? And is it compliant with at least the GDPR, besides from any other possible legal obligations that might carry the data? So for this, actually, the Working Party 29, and I will not go into too many difficult details, at least gave us some info on when is synthetic data considered good enough and far away from being personal data. And I am not very adept at the discerning good synthetic data. All I do is ask questions that are difficult, or at least for me. And all I want to know is the question of the three things, the three criteria that are set out, which are singling out. Can I single out any data point and therefore still discern if that is a person? Linkability. By using several data sets, can I still see if there's a personal data in there? And inference. Or can I infer from the synthetic data the fact that this still has to be person X or Y or Z and so on? And I myself am not the judge. So I'm not going to look at the data and see, I see that person X is still in this data set. So all I do is I go to the people that provided the data set, the synthetic data set, or derived it from production data, and will ask these questions and explain it to me. And in that way, with that discussion, by using different actors, I will finally get an answer, this might be usable and compliant synthetic data. And hopefully the might eventually becomes, this is definitely good synthetic data. So it matters a lot on what is the source and what is the way we go from A to B. And a good solution is half of the work.
Yeah.
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 I think it's true.
And yeah, I think it's an important topic that we will discuss in a bit because of course, yeah, this is something as synthetic data generation. The concept seems easy, but the practical implications are complex. That's of course why we are Syntho as expert in synthetic data, aim to make sure that there is also a default report with all the privacy matrices. But also, data accuracy checks to make sure that the synthetic data is as good as real on dataset or database level, and that the privacy matrices are generated properly to also make sure that you have, in case of an audit, the materials to make sure that you done it in the right manner.
Yeah.
But also curious, Francis, about your opinion about synthetic data generation. More from the testing perspective.
Yeah, of course. But I think, again, it gives you independency as a development team. And I especially say development team because the testers will, of course, use the data. But don't forget the people who are investigating data, or inspecting data for purposes of reporting, for example, right? It's during that development process, a lot of time is you use for analyzing your data, and they will, if they don't have representative data, they will go to prod, right? But they don't have the prod environment because they are not allowed to look in prod, right? Because there is something with security and privacy there. So it also helps your synthetic data. If you have, for example, what you guys are doing with AI and stuff, all your patterns, right, are in your synthetic data. And it's very helpful also for development. That's the one thing. The other side is, again, if for a tester you can share your data. You can share your data in your team, outside your team. You have the availability of data. You can maybe chop it in pieces. If you make a mistake, you will get your data back again. So you can store it, right, in a between brackets normal way, right? You can copy it maybe, right? So it gives you a lot of freedom and flexibility. Difficulty, what I see though, is interaction with different systems or systems outside your company. You have to really make great appointments there if it's possible to use synthetic data in your, what I just said, end-to-end testing, right? On the other hand, to me that is just a technical difficulty that you have to overcome. That's the one thing. On the other side, it is also maybe a risk thing to overcome. Is it really so important that you really have to do your connection test, your end-to-end test, live with two organizations or with two big systems? Not sure. We're currently living in an API. We're currently using a lot of APIs. So maybe you can start thinking about another API strategy, for example, if you do connections with the outside world. So actually, to me, I would always love to work with synthetic data. It will, again, because it will gives me freedom, and it gives me also, the trustfulness that I'm using data which is reflecting somehow the production.
Yeah.
And with all the benefits there, sharing, flexibility. Well, what can I say, Wim Kees? We need it.
Yeah.
I also really want to underline the principle that Francis mentioned, that anything can happen to your synthetic data set, and honestly, you might care that you have a leak in your system in general, but you won't care that the data set itself got out.
Exactly.
And that is a peace of mind that many company owners want to have. It is something that well, it can be bought. Apparently, it can, but a lot of people do not concern with it right now, and maybe they should.
I think they should. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's that's also an interesting to refer back to the website from the Dutch Authority on Personal Data again, because of course they also have the statement which data can I use to do tests, and recently they also suggested now to use synthetic data or mock data if it is available. And I think that's an interesting one. We will share the references of those locations with you in the recap mail, so that you have those details as well, and that you can run through that. And feel free to reach out if you need the translations as well, because the website is unfortunately in Dutch, but more than happy to translate it into English. I received some questions, and one of them is about the statement that the synthetic data should reflect the production data. And we already touched upon the QA report on the privacy side, but I think this question was really about the data accuracy side. So I just took some slides to share with you as an illustration to how that works. So what you see in the following slide is just some variables that are in a database. And here we demonstrate the distributions. So in gray, you see the original data, and in blue, you see the synthetic data. And we really make sure that that they're both captured in the right manner. To zoom in a little bit, so on the left side, you see, for example, churn, how many % of the customers churn, and you see that that the original data has similar persons that churned in comparison to the synthetic data. And that's also similar to the age category. That's a continuous variable. So you see a lot of people with an age of 50 and not a lot of people with an age of 100. So we really make sure that we mimic that as good as possible. And also, of course, the interrelationships. So we have here the correlations, so the relationships between variables. So this is a correlation matrix. We use color intensity to make it a little bit more appealing, to make sure that it looks well. But also here you see that also the correlations are captured well. And I think a final one, as we are also using synthetic data as test data for developing AI models, we collaborate closely with the data experts of SAS, and they actually approved the use of our synthetic data even for analytical purposes, so for AI development. As a reference, what you see here on the right side is the results of ML models, machine learning models trained on the original data, on anonymized data, and on synthetic data. And with anonymized data, for example, data masking, data binning, you typically see that you are destroying your data a bit, and that's actually what was also demonstrated in the case study. So that and that was also the conclusion. So synthetic data and original data show similar model performance on all performance matrices. Anonymized data show worse performance on all performance matrices. And also an interesting one, synthetic data generation, because we leverage the power of AI, works easy, fast, and is scalable. And it works exactly the same for all data. And I think that's actually a second question that we received. So that was a question about, are you supporting NoSQL databases like MongoDB, or are you limited to SQL database, or are you also supporting other connectors? So the answer is relatively simple. So we are not limited in terms of connectors. So of course we support SQL databases, but also non-SQL databases such as MongoDB, and we make sure that we can easily connect to the data to make sure that it runs smoothly. In terms of deployment, it's a containerized approach, because typically we want to make sure that the software is deployed in the environment of the customer. Also to make sure that there's no data being shared with Syntho, because that's of course the whole challenge that you want to overcome. So it's a Docker container, containerized approach, can be deployed wherever you want to, so on-premise or in your own cloud environment. And indeed, we support various connectors to connect to the original data to learn, of course, and a connection to the target environment to write the synthetic data to. So that's to give you also a little bit an idea about how the deployment and integration work with our platform. Then I see also a question about how mature the IT environment should be. Do you really need development test environments? I think, yeah, the answer is relatively simple. So yeah, basically we generate synthetic data. It can be, we can make a digital twin of your production environment, write it to your test environment. But of course, yeah, it can also be a flat file, like an Excel file or whatever. So in terms of maturity, yeah, we can, of course, go into all directions. So there are not really limitations there. And I also see the question about, does it matter if it's financial data, healthcare data, etc. So I think that's indeed the interesting part, because yeah, the technique works exactly the same for any data set, any data type, and therefore it doesn't matter if it's a healthcare data set, a finance data set, and where the data is stored. It's basically yeah, one fits approach to make it as easy as possible. Just going through another question. I think that one is captured. I see also another question from someone that asks, how does it actually looks like? How does the platform actually looks like? It's an interesting one. We didn't prepare for that, but just checking my colleague who is sitting next to me if we can do a brief to provide you with a brief idea about the platform interface. To give you an idea about how it actually works in terms of the user interface usability. So just checking if my colleague can join the call, and then there he is.
Live demo, always nice.
Always nice.
But also scary.
It's always nice to do a live demo and not prepared live demo, but let's see.
Always nice indeed. So I will just share my screen and start demoing. All right. Good that we have a demo server up and running. It's always helpful. All right. So how does it work? Basically, like with any platform, you log in as a user using username, password. Well, you basically sign in, and then you enter this, well, create workspace screen. So this is really the place where you can, well, define your workspace, create your workspace that's needed for synthesizing your data. So how would that work? Well, you can create a workspace entirely from scratch. So let's say we want to start off from a MySQL database containing privacy-sensitive data. Well, then we can fill in some details here about the source database, or where we want to read the original data from. Well, have to fill in all the details. Well, you would also have to do that for the target database. So that's where you want to write the synthetic data that you are generating, where you want to write that to. Well, you can then also give a name to the workspace and create it. But actually, let's for now just pick a workspace I actually already created before. Because yeah, in many occasions you actually want to ensure that your also your synthetic database stays up to date based on the updates in your original production database. So yeah, then it's very handy if you can just open a workspace you created before. Maybe you also already did some additional configurations. Well, you can just load that workspace from before. So yeah, here are a couple of workspaces. Let's take this this workspace containing connected to a database containing patient level data. So as you can see here on the left, we see all the tables that are in this database. For instance, we have a patient table over here. Yeah, so and in the middle you see like an overview of the data that's yeah, that's the original data essentially, which you want to synthesize so you can make it more freely accessible. Yeah, so in principle, the approach to synthesize your data is very easy. So you can actually directly click on the top right on generate, and then all the default settings are just inferred by our software and applied for generating your synthetic data. So then the AI will do most of the work and well, synthesize your data. But I think if you work with very large databases, in particular with many tables in there, you may want to make some additional configurations. And those kind of configurations we defined into table level configurations and column level configurations. So for instance, table level configurations. As you can see, all these tables here are now listed under synthesize. But yeah, it can be that you have particular tables that do not necessarily contain privacy sensitive data, but you still want to ensure that those tables are also copied to your synthetic database. So you still want to preserve them. For instance, this payers table contains only very few records, 10 records, with well, information about organizations. So that's, well, public information, you could say. Yeah, instead of synthesizing this particular table, you would actually just want to copy it over as is, so duplicate it. You can also, if there are particular tables that do not contain any relevant info at all, for instance, we have an empty table here, you can also say, okay, let's just exclude this table entirely. And you can also do that for other tables where you think, okay, I'm never going to use that anyway, so you can also exclude it. So those are really the table level operations. We then also have column level operations. Yeah, and I think those are in particular particularly interesting for columns containing personally identifiable information. Well, and those are really entities that directly link to an individual. So you can think of, as you see here, social security numbers, first, last names, maybe telephone numbers, those kind of entities. Well, the values in there are by definition directly linkable to an individual. So for those, those entities, you don't want to have the original values, of course, in your synthetic database. So what you can do specifically for those columns, you can apply what we call mockers. So for instance, for the social security number, we can apply a social security number mocker, even set the locale, so it can also be Dutch, and then it will take into account the specific format of the social security numbers in that country. Well, you can apply and then as you can see here on the right, under applied steps, it will apply this social security number mocker. Well, you can also do that for the first names, and for the last names. Well, and any other of the columns that were actually marked PII here. Actually, I didn't mark those columns as PII myself because there's an inbuilt PII scanner in the platform, which actually helps you to identify specifically those PII columns. Well, all the remaining columns where you don't apply those mockers will go through our AI and will automatically be synthesized. So yeah, so normally actually you would now just press generate, and you get like a little summary of all the settings you applied. You can start generating, and then you will get a synthetic database out of it. I think this particular database is not too big, so it will take around 20 minutes. But yeah, not really worth waiting during this session. So yeah, I think we already filled this database before, so we can just have a quick look at what that synthetic data then actually looks like. So now I'm first looking at the original data that we also saw in the self-service platform just now. Well, let's now have a quick look also at the synthetic table. You don't have to memorize these values by heart, but it's just to give an indication, okay, what does the synthetic table then look like? And as you can see, well, each individual row is completely new. It's entirely synthetic, so it's not one-to-one relatable to the original privacy-sensitive records, so to real patients. but it still contains, well, the same value as a whole. So you can still perform the same analysis. Yeah, also the particular columns where I applied the mocker, so the social security number, first name and last name columns, for instance, those are now filled with mock data, so essentially fake data. You may notice there are some columns containing asterisks values. Well, that's actually a safety mechanism built in if there are particular values that occur beyond a certain threshold. So if you have, for instance, unique values, then those unique values are automatically replaced by an asterisk, because those unique values can directly be linkable to an individual as well. But you can also apply a mocker instead. I did not do that here, but now then it, yeah, by safety, it applied an asterisk. All right, so yeah, so all the other columns basically went through our AI. And yeah, so for instance, relationships between location level information and maybe healthcare expenses, all those kinds of relationships are preserved. So it can be, for instance, that at particular locations, healthcare expenses are higher or lower in particular locations. All that information will be preserved in the synthetic data, and within tables, but also cross tables. So that's something good to take into account. All right. Actually, normally, yeah, there's also a quality assurance report generated for this particular table, but I don't think we have the time to go through that, I would say. Looking at case, what do you think? Is that...
Yeah, I think we showed already a bit. So let's see. I think there's another question. I think, Francis, you also wanted to share something. I think you're muted.
You're on mute. Oh, great demo. I just from the spot. So I think my compliments.
I think the first time you see it as well, right?
No, I saw it before, but just on the spot, I think it is wow. Nice.
Nice, and yeah, I think there's one poll question open, and I think yeah, this might also be one relevant to testing in real life. Does it take a lot of time and manual work to get your test data right? So we see quite some people voted on yes, 78% from the 162 people. Francis, do you recognize this or?
Totally. Especially if you create your own synthetic data. It's so hard to get all the exceptions in, to get all your routines in, all your patterns. That's so hard. And yeah, what can I say? Bad test data will give you bad results. So if you look at this question, people are actually putting a lot of effort into test data currently, because they know if you are a professional tester, and I'm not talking about manual or automation, because that's, I think, the same also for important, also synthetic test data, but they want to have their test data right, because they know if they have wrong test data or test data that's a little bit flaky, their results will be flaky. Yeah. So they will put a lot of effort in there. And if that effort can be reduced by trustful test data that they just can pick and again reuse or share, wow, that makes us our life a bit easier.
Yeah, exactly. That's good to know. And maybe also checking, Frederick, some final notes from your side, having seen the questions, maybe also the demo.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think it's also seeing the demo. It obviously is very interesting, and especially the possibilities that you have in discerning what is personal data and what is not. Sometimes help is needed. Therefore, any tool that can provide that help can be useful. Because we also touched upon the fact that a lot of people answered not to be using personal data, and it could be, not necessarily saying it is the case, that they might still be using personal data. So it is interesting to see if that number might go up if they were using a tool that provided them with insight in this regard. Eventually, though, the end goal would be to not use personal data unless absolutely necessary, because of all the benefits. And I think it would be nice if more people knew about this.
That's great for sharing indeed. And we haven't did that part of the demo, but we also have a so-called PII scanner that scans on personal data. That can be interesting one for those that are doubting about, hey, am I actually using personal data, yes or no? Because that's indeed, of course, the first question to answer. And then, concluding this webinar, of course, the question and topic of this webinar was, why do organizations use synthetic data as test data, as synthetic test data? 4 arguments, of course: production-like data. We aim to mimic the original data as good as possible. Privacy by design. There's a solution as synthetic data that is now suggested by the Dutch Authority on Personal Data. And it's a solution that works easy, fast, and agile because it aims to leverage the power of AI as much as possible. So that's this will be shared with you, of course, after the webinar. Thank you all for participating. Thanks for the speakers, Frederick, Francis. It was a pleasure to have you. Great to deep dive into the challenges around test data, getting test data right, and really interesting to discuss the legal aspects, practical aspects, and the relevance of testing in this digital transformation where we are in. Looking forward to speak to you all in the future. We'll share the contact details as well with you via the recap mail. And looking forward to speak to you all soon. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks all.
Ciao all.
Bye bye all.